Coming up, a distinguished Indigenous professor talks about his career and next chapter. We learn about the ecology at Leech Lake and its traditions. Plus, we talk more about a United Nations plan that aims to protect environmental defenders. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. ASU offers the only online undergraduate digital media literacy degree, teaching students how to recognize and combat inaccuracies on all platforms. They are using cutting-edge tools and tactics to separate fact from fiction in a digital world overloaded with misinformation. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start in Oklahoma, where Interior Secretary Deb Haaland heard stories from boarding school survivors last week. It was the first stop on her Road to Healing tour. Dakota McDowell-Wapakichi has this report.
Many people inside Riverside Indian School discussed their experience with federal Indian boarding schools at the first stop of the Road to Healing tour. U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland launched the tour with a listening session for the descendants and survivors of federal Indian boarding schools. Riverside is the oldest federally operated Indian boarding school in the nation still operating. Testimony came from many different schools, not just Riverside. Former students from Chilocco, Concho, Fort Sill, and many other schools gave testimony. Haaland said she hopes for good to come from the event.
We all carry the trauma in our hearts. My ancestors endured the horrors of the Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead. This is the first time in history that a cabinet secretary comes to the table with this shared trauma, and it's not lost on me. I'm determined to use this position for the good.
The survivors want to have their voices heard about changing the system. Witnesses spoke of assimilation and disrespect shown to them by boarding school staff.
We were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. I was punished a lot because I did talk. We were not allowed to talk our language or speak our language, which I also got punished for that.
Another experience came from Shawnee Chief Ben Barnes, who spoke on behalf of a Shawnee tribal member who attended Chilocco Indian School in northern Oklahoma. Chief Barnes said her experience included horrors like sexual assault and threats of being buried in a cemetery located near the school. Barnes agreed there needs to be change.
One of the things that we've come to learn as we've explored our own legacy with the boarding school is where state and federal lands are owned, where boarding schools now reside, those lands need to revert back to the tribal nations for direct administration. Those places need to be re-sanctified and consecrated back to our sovereigns.
Now, this isn't the only stop on the tour, as Haaland and company will be traveling to Hawaii, Arizona, Michigan, and South Dakota, with more states to be announced in 2023. Reporting from Riverside Indian School in Anadarko, Oklahoma, Dakota McDowell-Wapakichi, ICT News.
Now to New Mexico, where Taos Pueblo celebrated a major land-back anniversary over the weekend. Tribal citizens and supporters gathered to honor the 50th anniversary of the return of the sacred Taos Blue Lake. In 1906, the tribal lands were illegally taken by the United States. This meant tribal citizens had to ask for permission to practice their religion on their own lands. For decades, the tribe fought for its return. Then on July 8, 1970, President Richard Nixon announced his support to return the lake, even after objections from the Forest Service. A congressional act later that year sealed the deal. Key leaders in the fight shared in gratitude over the weekend, including Gilbert Suazo Sr., who was at the White House when Nixon made his announcement. Others who helped return the land, like Bobby Kilberg and LaDonna Harris, received medals from the Taos Tribal Council. In Cuba, a new generation is carrying on Indigenous knowledge. Current estimates show that 20,000 Indigenous people make up 30 communities here. Many live in farming communities, but also work in teaching and public health fields. Families in the island nation maintain Indigenous knowledge for planting and caring for animals. They also use practices involving traditional medicines and ceremonies. Indigenous farms produce 70% of crops in Cuba, and though the area is isolated by a mountain, the community's leader, Chief Panchito, likes it that way. Panchito says he is hopeful a newly formed council will help more traditions to be carried on. The 12-person council plans community and agriculture projects, as well as passing down traditional knowledge. To learn more about this story, visit our website, ictnews.org, and search for Kasiki's Advice, Learn to Live from Mother Earth. Well, we're getting the first sights of season 2 of the acclaimed TV show Reservation Dogs. FX released its trailer last week. The second season of the series premieres on Hulu on August 3rd with 2 back-to-back episodes. The trailer teases a more serious season as the coming-of-age teens deal with their more individual problems. Much of the cast is expected to return, with even more familiar faces being added. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, recently retired Professor Tad Johnson joins the show to talk about his 3-decade career in tribal law and policy, and a United Nations plan that aims to protect environmental defenders. But first, traditional ecology for Leech Lake. Stay with us. She's an educator and an advocate, and now she's a Bush Fellow. Shirley Nordrum has poured her life's work into her community. She's the environmental director for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. Shirley infuses traditional ecological knowledge into her teaching at the Leech Lake Tribal College, and she joins us today. Welcome, Shirley, and congratulations to you.
Thank you. I should clarify, I was the environmental director for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. A few years back, I took a job with the University of Minnesota as the federally recognized tribal extension educator. And I have been working with the Leech Lake, White Earth, and Red Lake nations, helping to revitalize traditional foods, work with wastewater, and like you mentioned, working on revitalizing traditional ecological knowledge as well.
Thank you for that clarification. I mean, we're here to talk about your Bush Fellowship, and it sounds like your work falls right in line with that. So tell us about your project.
It does. For my Bush Fellow, I applied and was accepted to the University of Minnesota Duluth to enter the Masters of Tribal Resource and Environmental Stewardship program. And so what that master's will do, in academia, they like you to have, the higher credentials, a master's or a PhD. My lived experiences as a practitioner of traditional things and my professional experience, 35 years as a natural resource educator, don't mean as much without those credentials. And so in order to, work at a tribal college setting or write curriculum for science classes, they like to see that those credentials. So I'm going back to school to get that master's degree.
And when will you start?
In the fall, soon, like in a month.
Well, you got to hit all of those back to school sales, the school supplies. I know that's always one of my favorite parts about going to school. I want to actually talk about environmental issues that tribes are facing in Minnesota. What stands out to you most?
Oh, there's so many. I just can't name them. But I think one of the bigger things is it's a combination of climate change and invasive species. Just the two together are creating more problems for all of our plant life, and be it aquatic or terrestrial. And so that's the thing that's a big challenge for us right now. And how do we mitigate those things? How do you mitigate climate change and remove invasive species at the same time? It's just an overwhelming problem. I used to think that the release of pollution was the biggest problem, and I don't believe that any longer.
When you're talking about the list of invasive species that are found, what stands out to you most?
Boy, that's a tough one. I guess one of the bigger things that I'm really concerned about aquatic wise right now is the zebra mussel. And they keep finding him. That little guy just keeps marching through the state. For a long time, he wasn't up here in our lakes, and now they're just finding him in one lake right after another. So they really do a lot of damage to the quality of the water and the dynamic of the ecosystem itself, from all the fish available to the plant life available.
I mentioned in the opening that you work with traditional ecological knowledge. For our viewers and our listeners who are maybe hearing about this term for the first time, maybe define it for us and what it means.
I didn't understand what it meant forever. I grew up in a household where my parents, both Ojibwe, practiced. We were big berry pickers, and so what my dad was always talking about, it's time to, and he'd name whatever it was we were supposed to be doing at that time. And what I didn't realize is that my dad was gifting me a traditional Ojibwe cycle of phenology. And so I understand the world from our what would be considered a phenology view of when to practice, when to harvest, when to get our fibers, those types of things. And there's practices that are in place to keep the ecosystem healthy. Fire was one of them. Fire has been removed from the landscape. And so the things that we did to keep the woods healthy, to keep the waters healthy, those things that are place-based, that are passed down generationally for thousands of years, that's traditional ecological knowledge. Comes from living in a place and understanding and practicing. And also your language, if you know it. There's a lot of it just built right into the language.
For tribal nations who are maybe hoping to regain some of this knowledge, what advice do you have for them in terms of really empowering themselves to look inward and find that knowledge?
Learn your language and just really go out and experience the land. A lot of people say, for example, picking sage. Spend some time with that sage. Don't just go out there and clip the sage and leave again. Spend some time, look around where you're at. Where is she growing? How is she growing? How did she grow each year? What was the season like? Did we get lots of rain? Was it very dry? How did that change how the sage grew? And talk to your elders about these things. Visit with them. I was very lucky to spend a lot of time visiting with an elder on Leech Lake by the name of Eva Bear. She lived to be, I believe, 102. Um, and boy, she really gave me a lot of knowledge about the way things used to be, the way things were when we were sitting and talking when she was in her 80s and 90s. So visiting with elders is critical.
Absolutely. Well, Shirley, I've loved visiting with you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the time. Miigwech.
Recently retired Professor Tad Johnson is the University of Minnesota's first Senior Director of American Indian Tribal Nations Relations. In the role, he serves as the bridge between the entire University of Minnesota system and the tribal nations in the region. Professor Johnson served in the tribal court system for more than 30 years and was instrumental in the creation of a Master's of Tribal Administration and Government degree. He joins the show to talk about his career. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
When you worked in Washington, D.C. on behalf of tribes, maybe reflect on what you're most proud of.
Well, it was a very productive time between 1990 and 1995. They just recently had passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, and so the act needed to get implemented. And so we held a series of hearings and allowed the states to negotiate compacts, and we held a series of oversight hearings on the implementation of the act, but we really didn't touch it. And the industry needed a moment to grow. The Tribal Self-Governance Act was very important. And we overturned two Supreme Court cases. One was Duro versus Reyna, which was actually overturned by my predecessor as a staffer Frank Ducheneau, who worked for Mo Udall, and then George Miller had to overturn it a second time because the first overturning only lasted 1 year. So we had to remove the sunset clause, as they say, and make it permanent. So, and the other one we overturned had to do with the sacramental use of peyote. We amended the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. But there was a lot of activity, especially in 93 and 94, when Clinton was president and the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. And Clinton did not veto any bills in those 2 years. So it was very productive on the Senate and the House side. So it was, I keep looking back on that. It was one of the great times of my life. And my wife keeps pointing out, you were miserable the whole time. You get up and drink half a cup of coffee, or half a carafe of coffee, and then sit there and watch the house before we go to bed. So, but I was obsessed with the job and every little detail and every little bill, and it was a great productive time.
When you look at that time and you look at the state of tribal nations within the federal government now, what stands out to you most, or what has changed the most?
Well, back then it was really bread and butter issues. It was healthcare, housing, and those are still important issues for most tribes. A lot goes on now in tribes have a little more money. Some tribes do. Most tribes are not, wealthy by any stretch of the imaginations. But there's arguments that go on about placing land in a trust, and sometimes it's what I've been told by my successors in the House and Senate is there's a lot of tribe versus tribe stuff, which is always the worst. I mean, usually back then it was the very early days of Indian gaming, and we needed to get the basics out to Indian people, and so it was the beginning of tribes becoming more autonomous, taking over more programs from the federal government and doing more things themselves. So it was kind of the end of capacity building and self-determination, and then the beginning of self-governance. And that happened in Nahasda with housing and the Multiple Self-Governance Act, the 477 Act. We passed all those in those days.
I'd love to continue talking about policy, but I want to be mindful of our time here together. And I want to switch gears and actually talk about your role helping Native students within the University of Minnesota system. Tell us about your role and maybe what you're most proud of there.
Well, it started off coming to UMD. They wanted me to develop a program on how to run a reservation, and on every tribal attorney's desk across America. And I've been a tribal attorney for over 35 years. So Felix Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law, but there's no handbook on how to run a reservation. And I was executive director of my reservation for a while in Bois Forte. And there was nothing that explained how appropriations work, nothing that explained accounting principles, nothing that explained, how to run things. So we wanted to develop a program that created that, and so we did. We developed the Master of Tribal Administration Governance program, which became successful. They said expect a few students the first year. Well, we had 30 applicants. After that, we developed the M-Trees program, the Master of Tribal Resource and Environmental Stewardship. Similar idea, how do we train people to be foresters and use tribal ecological knowledge? But then I started complaining to the Twin Cities campus about the fact that the feds consult with tribes, the state consults with tribes, but the University of Minnesota, which is supposed to be the thought leader of the state, doesn't consult with tribes at all. We did it at UMD as we were developing those programs. 2 years of consultation for MTAG, 3 years for M-Trees, and but the university as a whole wasn't doing that. So I complained to one vice president of equity and diversity, and then she left and a new one came in, and he thought that idea was fascinating, that we should be doing that. And I said, and they ended up creating this position of senior director of tribal relations, and I I took it, and I mean, I had to compete for it, but I got it. And I said, this is not enough. You should have somebody advising the president. And if you want to have somebody good, what I was looking at was the ASU model where they hired Peterson Zaw to advise the president. I said, you need a former tribal leader. And there's only one person I can see doing this, which is Karen Diver, who used to lead the Fond du Lac Band at Chippewa. And then she went off to advise President Obama. And then she went off, got hired by the University of Arizona. And I was like, why is she at Arizona? Why isn't she here at Minnesota? And so finally I got listened to. The president, who was by then a woman, met Karen, they hit it off. And it was like, then I had kind of like mission accomplished. So the three things I accomplished while I was there, I think we got American Indian advisory boards going at all the campuses. We created something called the Truth Project, where we started a dialogue with all the tribes and wanted to get the past, present, and future snapshot of their view of the university. And then hiring Karen was the number one thing. So after we did that, I was ready to go. So I turned 65 tomorrow, actually. And I thought it's a good time to retire. So I did.
Well, Professor Johnson, an early happy birthday to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
The first climate agreement to center Indigenous voices is gaining international support. The Escazú Agreement establishes the relationship between human rights and environmental protections. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues urged its member states to adopt it. ICT national correspondent Karina Dominguez joins us now with more. Hi, Karina. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Elios Anyavu. Thanks for having me.
Let's just jump right in here. Tell us about this agreement and essentially what it means.
Yes, so this agreement is, very important to Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people as well. So it's the first agreement to center Indigenous voices, to really put a focus on Indigenous perspectives, and it's really the only climate agreement that has laid out protections for environmental land defenders who face, a slew of human rights abuses, and a lot of times are displaced. So this actually originated between Latin American and Caribbean countries. The agreement, took some years to negotiate, but it was signed in 2018 in Escazú, Costa Rica, but it's formally known as the Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's really important that the United Nations Permanent Forum, adopted this, or, recommendation that, other member states of its, adopt this agreement because as I said before, this is the only one that actually has the protections for environmental defenders. And, with expansion beyond that region, beyond Caribbean and Latin America, you'll definitely see a lot more protections for people if it's implemented properly.
I understand that the Permanent Forum's newly elected chair actually addressed the Escazú Agreement in their remarks. Tell us about what they said.
Yes, that newly elected chair was Dario Jose Mejia Montalvo. And so during his opening remarks, he did mention it, which I think was very powerful and really shows the support, that this world, the world's largest body of Indigenous leaders, that's what this UNPFII gathering is. To see that support on that level was huge. So he just told people something along the lines of, Indigenous people have always been about protecting the environment. It's not just something that's like a fad or a fashion or something that is done for social networks. It's very real and has a very real impact on their lives. It dates back to the existence, before the existence of borders, is what he said. But he urged everyone to, adopt it, to subscribe to the agreement. And not only that, but if they have, to implement it faster.
How does this plan actually align with the work of Indigenous environmental defenders?
Yes, well, the problem is, with the kind of economic, situations that we have in a lot of different countries. They call for growth, they call for more mining, and a lot of these indigenous territories are very rich in resources, from logging to gold mining to water. There's a lot of different, resources that different groups are after, or even narco-paramilitary groups. So there have been reports that, there's been an uptick in killings. And so, for one example, one group did say 2020 was a really bad year for environmental land defenders as far as murders. But then even more recent data is showing that those numbers are even continuing to increase. There's this group in Colombia, it's called INDEPAZ for short, but it's the Institute for Studies of Development and Peace. And so as recently as July 4th, their most recent data, 99 defenders had been killed, and about a third of those were indigenous or Afro descent people. So, it is a very, real problem. So this Escazú agreement offers a solution, but as many environmental defenders that I talked to pointed out, it really is up to the state, on the local level, on the international level as well, to implement these things and to make sure that people are held accountable.
Well, we'll continue to follow this. Karina, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.